Hi friends, this is your pal Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Gamemasters' recent video, 5 Myths About Dungeons and Dragons. Gamemasters, really smart, wonderful, kind guy, right? His channel, excellent content, right? He was 100% wrong about every single myth. Everything he said is a myth about Dungeons and Dragons is 100% true, and I want to get into it. All right, here we go. So one of the myths he said is D&D is medieval fantasy. He's like, no, no, no. D&D is not just medieval fantasy, right? Now here's the problem with that. That is completely incorrect. Okay, so first of all, let's deal with the configuration of this. So he's saying a myth. Now a myth is what the majority of people believe. Okay, so he's saying it's not true. He's saying that what 51% of people believe about Dungeons and Dragons is not true, that it's not just all medieval fantasy. Now here's the problem with that, okay? At the macro level, at the 51% level, Dungeons and Dragons is absolutely medieval fantasy. Like not, and they just keep doubling down and tripling down and quadrupling down and 5 times down and 6 times down and 7 times down on this, right? So like, if you don't think it's medieval fantasy, how do you explain that they already have Forgotten Realms, and then they put in Greyhawk as a brand new setting in 5i, right, in the 2024 core rulebook DMG? That's medieval fantasy, right? Like, then in addition to that, right, they literally, like, you used to be oh well, Dungeons and Dragons is primarily systematized Tolkien. It used to be like, you trust me, it is, right? Now it's not debatable. It's literally systematized Tolkien. Lord of the Rings world is sitting on Dungeons, is 100% unmitigated, purchasable D&D canon, right? You no longer are like, oh, Dungeons and Dragons is inspired by Lord of the Rings. It is literally, Lord of the Rings is literally a Dungeons and Dragons setting now and forevermore, right? Okay, done. Box checked, right? That's medieval fantasy, right? Like, and the list goes on from there, right? Mystara, and there's so many, Blackmore, right? And there's just so many copies of medieval fantasy, okay? And then you're like, well, what about Eberron? It's still got every Tolkien species, every single one. What about Exandria? Still fundamentally based in Tolkien mythology, right? Strays the barest amount, right? Like, and then and then you're like, well, what about Darksun? They never brought that into 5e. They never did a 5e or a 5i book for it, not once. It's in second and fourth, right? So the reality is, Dungeons and Dragons 100% is medieval fantasy. Now, can you play other things? Absolutely. Okay. At the micro level, right? After you have done medieval fantasy with Dungeons and Dragons, then and only then may you even think about approaching anything else with Dungeons and Dragons, right? So absolutely you could run a, Thin Blue Line campaign. Absolutely you could run a Star Wars campaign. And they quite literally, Wizards of the Coast owned Star Wars license and used D&D rules for it for a decade, I think. Right? Probably about 5 years, I think, something like that. Yeah, I mean, like, it was a lot, right? Like, and so you could do those things, but you can only reach there after you have come through the gate of medieval fantasy in Dungeons and Dragons. So you have, and the thing is, you cannot start. First of all, you cannot start playing Dungeons and Dragons until you've played Dungeons and Dragons medieval fantasy. Oh, even Stranger Things, right? Like, that's medieval fantasy. The Upside Down, the Thessal Hydra adventure. It's all like, and everything they put into for Stranger Things, it's all, straight Tolkien medieval fantasy, right? And the reality is, you can do other things with Dungeons and Dragons, but only after you've gone through a long way to learn Dungeons and Dragons through medieval fantasy. And the reason why is the entire game is built around the core 4, right? The fighter, the rogue, the wizard, and the cleric. And if you don't understand that functional configuration, there's no possibility you're going to be able to succeed as a dungeon master or a dragon master. You're not going to be able to play or run Dungeons and Dragons. You simply won't, right? It 100% is medieval fantasy, okay, at the macro level. And you can play, and the icing, the best way to understand it, the cake is the cake. The icing is on the top. But to say that the cake ain't cake is wrong, right? There's a thin layer of icing on the top that is every other genre. But the cake of D&D is medieval fantasy. And to pretend otherwise is shockingly wrong, right? So Gamemasters, great guy, great channel, great content. But on this one thing, he could not be more wrong. And he got every single myth wrong. Every single myth. I'm going to break them all down. That is how D&D, very much, it's not a myth. It is a hard fact, in my humble opinion, that Dungeons and Dragons is medieval fantasy. Every single word you just heard in this video is my humble opinion. Absolutely nothing more, absolutely nothing less. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider like, subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.